The wagon slammed sideways against the ranch gate so hard, the left wheel shattered and threw Clara Whitcomb into the mud. She hit the ground with a cry, one hand clutching the torn satchel at her chest, and when she lifted her face, she saw 3 children frozen on the porch of the Hale Ranch. The youngest had no shoes. The middle boy held a kitchen knife with both hands. The oldest girl stood in front of them like she had already learned how to be a mother. Clara was only 18, still wearing the plain grey dress her stepfather had chosen for the county office that morning, still carrying the paper that said she now belonged in this house as wife to a man she had never met. Behind her, out on the road, dust rose where 2 riders had not yet given up the chase. And whatever Silas Crow had traded her for, it was not a marriage alone. Ezra Hale came out of the barn with a rifle in his hand, and grief carved so deep into his face it looked older than the mountains. He was broad-shouldered, unshaven, and silent, the kind of man children obeyed because sorrow had left no room for gentleness. He looked first at Clara, then at the broken wagon, then past her toward the road. Inside, he said. Clara tried to stand, but her ankle folded beneath her. The youngest child made a small sound, not quite pity and not quite fear. Ezra crossed the yard in 3 long strides, lifted Clara like she weighed less than a flour sack, and carried her toward the porch without asking permission. Now, if you have ever seen a person brought to a door with nothing left but fear, you know mercy is decided before words can explain it. The oldest girl stepped aside only when Ezra said her name. Ruth. Ruth lowered the knife, but not her eyes. Is she the one Ezra did not answer? His jaw tightened when he saw the bruise near Clara's wrist where someone had gripped her too hard. Inside the house, the stove had gone low. A baby's cradle sat empty in the corner, though there was no baby in the room. Clara noticed it before she noticed the dried blood on the cuff of Ezra's sleeve. He set her in a chair. Who is coming? Clara swallowed. Her fingers opened around the satchel, just enough for him to see the edge of a folded letter sealed in blue wax. My stepfather, she whispered, and the marshal he paid. Ezra's face changed at the word marshal. Outside, one of the children gasped. Through the front window, 2 lanterns had appeared at the far bend of the road, swinging low and steady through the dust. Ezra placed the rifle beside the door, turned the lock, and stood between Clara and the coming lights. The first knock struck the door before Ezra could move the table against it. Ruth pulled the 2 smaller children behind the stove, and Clara sat stiff in the chair, with mud on her hem, 1 shoe missing, and both hands clenched around that satchel as if it held the last breath in her body. Ezra did not raise the rifle. He only set 1 palm flat against the door and listened. Mr. Hale, a smooth voice called from the porch. Open up. We have lawful business. Clara's face went white. Ezra looked back at her. That him, she nodded once. Silas Crow. The name made Ruth tighten her grip on her little brother's shoulder. Ezra noticed it. He noticed everything without seeming to look. The boy with the knife was called Matthew, and he kept his blade pointed at the floor, like a child who had been told to be brave before he understood what bravery cost. The little one, Annie, had bare feet blackened with cold mud, and she stared at Clara's bruised wrist as if she recognized the shape of fear. Ezra leaned close to the door. Come back in daylight. A second man answered, this time rougher. She's legal property under contract. Her stepfather signed. County office witnessed it. Clara flinched so hard the chair creaked. Ezra's voice stayed low. No woman is property on my land. Silence followed outside, but it was not retreat. It was men deciding how much trouble mercy was worth. Then Silas Crow laughed softly. She is your wife, Hale. I delivered what you paid for. Now I only want what she stole. Ezra turned his head toward Clara. I stole nothing, she whispered, but her hands closed tighter around the satchel. Ezra did not press her. He barred the door with the table, then crossed to the stove and fed 2 split logs into the fire. The room took on a dull orange glow. He filled a tin basin with warmed water, tore a clean strip from an old flour sack, and set it beside Clara's swollen ankle. His movements were practical, almost stern, like tenderness offended him, but duty did not. I can do it, Clara said. I reckon you can, he answered, but you're shaking too hard. Ruth watched from across the room with suspicion sharp enough to cut thread. Pa, don't let strangers sit in Ma's chair. Ezra's hand stopped for half a breath. Clara looked down and tried to rise. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Sit, Ezra said. The word was not kind, but it protected her. Ruth heard that and looked away, ashamed of herself and angry for being ashamed. Ezra wrapped Clara's ankle with the flour sack cloth. When his sleeve pulled back, she saw an old burn scar running from his wrist toward his elbow. On the mantel above him sat a small framed photograph of a woman with calm eyes and 3 children gathered close. Beside it lay a folded baby blanket, blue at the edges, untouched by dust. Clara understood then that this was not an empty house. It was a house still arranged around a death. Outside, a boot scraped the porch. Open the door, Hale Crow said. You do not want a marshal writing your name beside mine. Ezra stood, picked up the rifle, and placed it across 2 pegs above the door, instead of pointing it. That frightened Clara more than if he had aimed it. He was not a reckless man. He was measuring the law, the night, and the children in the same breath. Annie suddenly slipped away from Ruth and came to Clara's side. She held out 1 heel of bread, hard as bark. Clara stared at it. That's yours, Annie whispered. You look hungry. Something in Clara almost broke then, but she did not cry. She broke the heel in 2 and gave the larger piece back to the child. Annie did not eat it. She hid it in her apron pocket, quick and secret. Ezra saw that too. He turned toward Ruth. Heat the beans. Ruth frowned. For her. For everyone. The simple order changed the room more than any welcome could have. Matthew lowered the knife. Annie stayed beside Clara's chair. Ruth took the pot from the stove hook with more noise than necessary, but she did it. Only then did Clara open the satchel. Inside was not jewelry, nor money, nor anything a bride might carry to a new husband. There was a white nightdress folded small, a church ribbon, and beneath them a letter sealed in blue wax. Clara held it out with both hands. My mother wrote this. Before she died, she said. She said if Silas ever tried to sell me, I was to bring it to Ezra Hale. Ezra did not take the letter at first. The fire snapped once loud in the room. Clara looked up at him. She said you would hate the sight of me, but she said you were the only man left who knew the truth. Ruth turned slowly from the stove. Ezra's face had gone still in a way that made the children quiet. The name written across the letter was not Clara's. It was not Silas Crow's either. It was Ezra's dead wife's maiden name. He took the letter, at last broke the blue wax, and read only 3 lines before the colour left his face. His hand closed around the paper until it nearly tore. What truth? Clara asked. Ezra looked toward the empty cradle in the corner, then toward the door where Silas Crow waited with a paid marshal in the dark. Before he could answer, the window beside the stove shattered inward. Ruth screamed. Matthew pulled Annie down. A stone rolled across the floor and stopped against Clara's bare foot. Tied around it was a strip of paper. Ezra lifted it and read the words aloud, his voice cold enough to quiet the whole house. Send out the girl and the letter, or the children burn with the barn. Ezra moved before the smoke smell reached the house. He thrust the blue wax letter into Clara's hands, pulled the table from the door, and looked at Ruth. "Take Annie and Matthew to the root cellar. Keep low. Don't open for any voice but mine." Ruth's face had gone pale, but she did not argue. That was the terrible education grief had given her. She scooped Annie close, caught Matthew by the sleeve, and hurried them toward the trapdoor beneath the braided rug. Clara tried to stand. "I can help. You can stay alive," Ezra said. Outside, firelight licked orange along the barn wall. Someone had thrown a lantern through the hayloft. The old boards smoked first, then caught with a hungry crackle that made the horses scream. Ezra grabbed a wet feed sack from the rain barrel and ran toward the barn, not because the barn mattered more than the house, but because if the wind turned, everything he had left would burn before dawn. Clara watched him disappear into the smoke, and for one awful moment she understood why her mother had sent her here. Ezra Hale was not gentle. He was not warm. But when danger came, he moved toward it. On the porch, Silas Crow stepped into the lantern glow with his coat buttoned neat and his hat brim dry, as if he had not ordered fire against children. Beside him stood Marshal Pike, a thick man with a county badge and no shame in his eyes. 2 hired riders waited behind them, their horses stamping at the smell of smoke. Crow smiled at Clara through the broken window. "Come along now. You have caused Mr. Hale enough trouble." Clara held the letter against her ribs. "You burned his barn. I warned him." Crow's voice stayed polite. "A man who shelters stolen property invites loss." Marshal Pike cleared his throat. "Girl, by signed household transfer and marital delivery, you are bound to remain where your lawful guardian placed you, unless fraud is proven. That paper in your hand belongs to Mr. Crow if it concerns his household." Clara's fear did not leave, but something steadier rose beneath it. "My mother's words don't belong to him." Crow's smile thinned. Ezra came back from the barn, coughing coat sleeve, smoking one hand wrapped in a wet sack. He had gotten the horses loose. Behind him, flames crawled up the loft, but the house still stood. He stepped between Clara and the porch rail. Crow looked him over. "You always were costly when crossed, Hale." Ezra said nothing. Marshal Pike lifted a folded paper. "I have authority to collect the girl and any property removed from Silas Crow's home." "No child leaves this house tonight," Ezra said. Crow's eyes moved toward the floor, toward the place Ruth and the little ones had vanished. "I hear more than one child in there." The rifle came up in Ezra's hands, not high enough to kill, high enough to promise. "Speak of mine again, and you best speak from the road." For the first time, Crow stopped smiling. Then Ruth's voice trembled from below the floorboards. Pa Ezra did not turn. "Stay down." But that small voice changed the shape of the standoff. Clara saw the truth of it plainly. Silas Crow had not come only for her. He had come for whatever her mother had known, and he was willing to use Ezra's children as the rope around Ezra's throat. The barn roof groaned. Sparks rose into the dark. Crow adjusted his gloves. "Your dead wife's name is on that letter, isn't it?" Ezra's jaw tightened. Clara looked at him. How does he know that Crow answered for him? Because secrets rot, Miss Whitcomb. They stink through the boards eventually. Ezra took one step down from the porch. "You want the letter? Come by the courthouse at sunup." Marshal Pike laughed. "Court opens when I say it opens." "No," Ezra said. "Court opens when Judge Bell hears why you're burning barns before breakfast." Pike's face darkened at the mention of the judge. Crow studied Ezra a moment, then leaned slightly toward Clara. "He has not told you, has he? Your mother did not send you here because Mr. Hale is noble. She sent you here because his wife died carrying the same secret. Ask him what was buried with Mary Hale. Ask him why a cradle sits empty in that room." Clara turned, but Ezra's eyes stayed on Crow. The villain's goal came clear. In the smoke, Silas Crow did not want Clara because he cared who she married. He wanted the letter because it proved he had stolen land, forged a death record, and sold a girl to bury the last witness. Crow tipped his hat. "Sun up then. But if that letter reaches town, every child under your roof becomes part of the matter." He stepped back into the dark, and Marshal Pike followed with the slow confidence of men who believed paper could wash blood clean. When the riders were gone, Ezra stood in the yard until the barn collapsed inward with a roar. Only then did he lower the rifle. Clara came down the porch steps, favoring her wrapped ankle. What was he talking about? Ezra did not answer at first. He walked into the house, pulled aside the braided rug, and helped Ruth lift Annie and Matthew from the cellar. Annie was shaking so badly, Clara gave her the hidden bread from her own pocket and pretended not to see when the child tucked it away again. Then Ezra knelt by the empty cradle. With his pocket knife, he pried up a loose board beneath it. From the hollow below, he drew out a small tin box blackened at the corners. His hands were careful now, almost afraid. Inside lay a baby ribbon, a tax receipt, a page torn from a church register, and a second letter written in Mary Hale's hand. Ruth whispered, "That was Ma's box." Ezra nodded once. Clara held her mother's letter beside Mary's. The handwriting was different, but both women had named the same date, the same land office, and the same child. Matthew frowned. What child? Ezra looked at Clara then, and the guarded wall in him cracked enough for grief to show through. "Your mother had a baby sister," he said quietly. "Born alive. Declared dead before sundown. Mary found out Crow paid the clerk to change the record." Clara's breath caught. "Why?" "Because that baby carried your grandfather's claim to the north pasture and the creek land. Without her, Crow could take it through your mother, then through you." Ruth looked from Clara to her father. "Did Ma die because of it?" Ezra closed the tin box. "She died trying to get the proof to town." No one spoke after that. Even the burning barn seemed quieter. At dawn, Ezra wrapped the letters in oilcloth and tucked them inside his vest. Clara stood beside him on the porch, no longer held up by fear alone. Ruth brought him Mary's old Bible, the one with births and deaths written in the back. Matthew handed him the kitchen knife without being asked, as if surrendering childhood for one more morning. Ezra gave it back. "Keep it by the stove. Not in your hand, unless you must." A wagon creaked from the road before the sun cleared the ridge. Not Crow this time. It was Mrs. Bell, the schoolteacher, driving hard with her bonnet untied, and a terrified banker beside her. The banker's cheek was bruised, and his spectacles hung crooked from one ear. Mrs. Bell pulled the wagon short of the gate. "Ezra Crow has men at the courthouse already." The banker swallowed and looked toward the children before he found the courage to speak. "I kept the old ledger," he said. "The real one. But Pike knows. They're coming for it before noon." The road to town looked empty until Ezra saw the Crows lift from the cottonwoods. He reined the wagon hard left before the first shot cracked across the ridge. The bullet tore through the seat plank where Clara's shoulder had been a breath before. Mrs. Bell cried out and ducked low, gripping the reins with white knuckles, while the banker threw himself flat among the flour sacks and clutched the old ledger to his chest like a frightened preacher holding a Bible. Ezra shoved Clara down beside Ruth and the children. "Stay below the boards. I can still walk," Clara said. "I did not ask what you could do." That rough answer might have wounded her the night before. Now she heard what sat beneath it. He was not ordering her because she was weak. He was ordering her because he had already lost one woman on a road with proof in her hands, and he would not watch history repeat itself. Two riders came out from behind the trees. Crow's men. Their horses ran wide, trying to turn the wagon toward the dry wash where no town eyes could see. Ezra handed the reins to Mrs. Bell, stood in the wagon bed, and fired once at the dirt in front of the lead horse. The animal reared, throwing its rider into the brush. The second rider came closer. Matthew rose before anyone could stop him and flung the kitchen knife with both hands. It did not strike the man. It struck the leather strap holding his saddle roll. The roll dropped, tangled under the horse's legs, and sent the rider sprawling into the dust. Ezra stared at his son for one stunned second. Matthew swallowed. "You said only if I must." Ezra's face tightened with fear, pride, and something like pain. "Get down." They reached the bridge with smoke behind them and the town bell ahead. But Marshal Pike was waiting at the far end with 3 deputies, all of them armed, all of them standing under the county notice board, as if the law itself had grown teeth. Pike lifted one hand. "Hale, step down. You are under arrest for theft, harboring a runaway, and firing on lawful riders." The banker whimpered. "He'll take the ledger." Clara looked at Ezra. "Then give it to me." "No. If they search you, they find the letters. If they search him, they find the ledger." She reached for Ruth's school slate and the strip of ribbon from her satchel. "But they won't search the girl they think is already beaten." Ezra understood before she finished. He hated it. She saw that. But he slid the oilcloth letters beneath the loose lining of her satchel, while Mrs. Bell tucked the ledger under Clara's skirts, bound flat against her leg with the school ribbon. Ruth watched with wide eyes, and Clara held her gaze. "Do not be afraid of what you see me do," Clara whispered. "Be afraid only if I stop standing." Then she stepped from the wagon before Ezra could stop her and limped across the bridge alone. Pike smiled. "There's the sensible bride." Clara lowered her eyes the way Silas Crow had trained her to do. "I want to go to the courthouse. You want to go home. I have no home with Mr. Crow." For a moment, Pike's smile failed. That was when Judge Bell opened the courthouse door behind him. He was a thin old man with silver hair suspenders over his shirt, and fury held tight enough to look like calm. "My courtroom is open," the judge said, "and any man who blocks a witness from entering may explain himself under oath." The townspeople had gathered in doorways, windows, and along the boardwalk. They had seen the burned sleeve on Ezra's arm. They had seen Clara's bruised wrist. They had seen Pike standing between a young woman and the courthouse. Seeing is a quiet thing, but sometimes it breaks a town's sleep. The courtroom smelled of lamp oil dust and damp wool. By the time Judge Bell took the bench, every wooden seat was filled. Silas Crow sat near the front in a clean black coat, his hands folded over a silver-handled cane. He looked less like a criminal than a man waiting to collect rent. Pike stood beside him with his badge polished bright. Ezra sat behind Clara, with Annie in his lap. Ruth pressed against his right side, and Matthew standing at the aisle like a small guard who had not yet learned to tremble after the fight was done. Crow's lawyer produced the first paper. A marriage delivery contract, a guardian's transfer, a county seal, a statement that Clara Whitcomb, being of lawful age but under household obligation for unpaid debts, had been placed as wife in the Hale home with consideration paid. The words sounded clean when read aloud. That was the worst of it. Judge Bell looked at the paper for a long while. "Mr. Hale, did you pay money to Silas Crow for this girl?" Ezra's eyes stayed forward. I paid a debt marker months ago for feed and cattle after the drought. I never paid for a girl." Crow sighed gently. A lonely widower may regret his bargain once the town hears it. The room shifted. Clara felt it. The official paper had weight. Ink had confidence. Her fear returned with teeth. Then Pike laid another paper before the judge. "And I have a warrant sworn this morning. Ezra Hale stole private correspondence and bank property, then resisted lawful recovery." Judge Bell's expression hardened. "Mr. Hale." Before Ezra could answer, Pike turned. "Search him." 2 deputies moved toward Ezra, and he grabbed his vest. Ruth stood. Matthew reached for nothing, because the knife was gone, and he was only a boy again. Ezra raised both hands slowly. The deputies found Mary Hale's Bible in his coat. They found the tin box. They found the old tax receipt. But they did not find Clara's mother's letter, and they did not find the ledger. Crow leaned back, satisfied. Sentiment and family scribbling do not overturn county record. For one terrible moment it seemed he was right. Judge Bell opened Mary's Bible. Births and deaths filled the back pages in careful ink. He looked tired when he saw them, as if he wanted them to be enough and knew they might not be. A family Bible helps memory, Mr. Hale. It does not by itself prove fraud. Ruth's face fell. Crow stood, then smooth as oil. "Your Honor, this is a sad household. No one denies it. Mr. Hale lost a wife. Miss Whitcomb lost a mother. But sorrow has made a conspiracy out of lawful business. The girl was fed in my home, clothed in my home, protected in my home. When she repays kindness by theft, and Mr. Hale repays legal order with gunfire, I ask this court to return property, enforce the warrant, and let decent citizens be spared more spectacle." Clara's stomach turned at the word kindness. Judge Bell looked at her. "Miss Whitcomb, have you anything lawful to present?" Pike's eyes narrowed. Clara tried to stand, but pain from her bound ankle shot up her leg. Ezra moved to help her. She shook her head once and stood on her own. "Yes, sir." Pike took one step forward. "She has been coached." Clara looked at him, then truly looked. "No, Marshal. I have been bought, carried, chased, and threatened, but not coached." A murmur moved through the room. She reached under the torn lining of her satchel and brought out her mother's letter. The blue wax was broken now, but the handwriting remained. Judge Bell took it and read in silence. His brow changed. Not much. Enough. Crow's cane tapped once against the floor. The judge read aloud only the necessary lines. Clara's mother had written that Silas Crow forced her to sign over the north pasture after her infant sister was declared dead. She wrote that the baby had breathed, cried, and been carried from the room by a paid midwife before the church bell marked sundown. She wrote that Mary Hale had found the altered church register and hidden the proof. Crow stood. A dead woman's accusation. "Sit down," Judge Bell said. But still Clara saw doubt in the jurors' faces. A letter was powerful, but a letter from the grave could be called grief. Revenge, confusion. Crow knew it too. He turned his face just enough toward the banker. The banker lowered his head. Judge Bell noticed. "Mr. Alden." The banker flinched as if struck. "You work at the Land Office records desk?" "Yes, Your Honor. Did you bring a ledger?" The banker's mouth opened. No sound came. Crow's voice stayed soft. "Careful, Alden. Men with failing memories often lose their positions." Alden looked at Pike. Pike touched the butt of his pistol. The banker nearly sat back down. Then Annie slipped from Ezra's lap and walked across the aisle. No one moved to stop her. She held out the heel of bread she had hidden in her apron since the night before. "Mister," she said, "when you're scared, you can keep this for later." The courtroom went utterly still. Alden stared at that hard piece of bread as if it were judgment itself. His face crumpled not into tears, but into shame too old to hide. He reached under his coat and pulled free the ledger Clara had carried against her leg. "I kept it," he whispered. "God forgive me, I kept it." Crow shouted, "That book is stolen." Alden's voice failed once. He looked at Clara's bruised wrist, at Ezra's burned sleeve, at Mary Hale's Bible on the judge's desk, and then he forced the words out. The county seal on Mr. Crow's claim was pressed 3 days before the death entry was made. The baby was not dead when the land transfer began, and the signature on the later deed was not Clara's mother's hand. She was left-handed. That deed was signed right-handed. Judge Bell leaned forward. "Can you prove that Alden opened the ledger to a page marked with string? Her bank signature is here. Left slant. Same week. Same name. Different hand." The courtroom changed. Not loudly, not all at once, but the lie lost its roof. Mrs. Bell stood from the back. "Mary Hale brought me the church register page before she died. I was afraid to speak because Pike said my school would be closed." Pike snapped, "Woman, sit down." Judge Bell struck the bench with his gavel. "Marshal Pike, you will address witnesses with respect or surrender. That badge before I ask twice." The badge no longer looked bright. It looked small. "Mrs." Bell walked forward and placed the torn church register page beside the ledger. The dates matched. The names matched. The false death entry had been written over scraped paper, but beneath it, faint as a ghost, the original words remained. Female child. Born living. Clara gripped the bench. Judge Bell removed his spectacles and looked at Crow. "You tried to erase a child so you could steal land. Then you tried to sell that child's niece to bury the matter." Crow's face emptied of courtesy. "You cannot prove intent." Ezra spoke for the first time since the hearing began. "You burned my barn with my children inside the house." Matthew stood straighter. Ruth took Annie's hand. Clara did not look down. Alden added one last thing, barely above a whisper. He paid Pike from the same account used to file the false deed. Marshal Pike turned toward the door. The townsmen by the aisle did not move aside. Judge Bell's voice filled the room. "Silas Crow, you are remanded for fraud, arson, coercion, and conspiracy pending full trial. Marshal Pike, surrender your badge and weapon to the court." Pike reached for his pistol anyway. Ezra moved first, but he was too far. Clara picked up the silver-handled cane Crow had dropped and struck Pike across the wrist with every ounce of terror he had put into her. The pistol clattered across the floor and stopped at Judge Bell's boot. No one called her weak after that. Outside, the town bell rang once then again. Not for fire this time, but for the end of a fear that had lasted too many years. When they stepped out of the courthouse, the sun had cleared the ridge. Crow and Pike were led away under guard by men who had looked at the ground the day before and now looked straight ahead. Clara stood on the courthouse steps with the ledger in her arms and Mary Hale's Bible against her heart. The law had spoken, but healing had not. The barn was gone. The children were shaking. Ezra's burned hand trembled when he tried to button his coat. Ruth looked at Clara, still unsure where this left them. "Are you going away now?" the girl asked. Clara looked toward the road back to the ranch. where smoke from the ruined barn still marked the sky. "I don't know," she said softly. Ezra heard her answer, and for once he had no command ready. The ride back to the Hale Ranch was quieter than the ride to town. No bullets cracked from the cottonwoods. No riders cut across the road. No marshal waited at the bridge with polished brass and dirty hands. Still, every time a horse shifted behind the wagon, Annie flinched and tucked her bare feet beneath her dress. Matthew kept looking toward the ridge. Ruth sat with her shoulders stiff, one hand resting on Mary Hale's Bible, as if the book might disappear if she stopped touching it. Justice had come, but fear had not yet learned the road was clear. When the wagon reached the ranch, the burned barn stood black against the morning sky. Smoke curled from the last fallen beam. The gate hung crooked where Clara had been thrown into the mud the night before, and the shattered wagon wheel still lay beside it like a piece of the old life refusing to move. Ezra stepped down first. His burned hand was wrapped in cloth, but he tried to use it anyway. Clara saw the pain cross his face and took the water bucket before he could lift it. "I can carry that," he said. "I reckon you can," she answered. "But you're shaking too hard." For the first time since she had met him, Ezra almost smiled. The children heard it. Not the smile, but the change in the air around it. Ruth looked at Clara for a long moment, then walked to the porch and picked up the kitchen knife Matthew had left there before dawn. She carried it inside and placed it in the drawer. Not on the table, not in her hand, in the drawer. That was the first small miracle. For weeks after Crow and Pike were taken away, the house did not become happy all at once. Wounds do not obey a judge's gavel. Annie still hid bread in her apron. Matthew still woke before sunrise and checked the window by the stove. Ruth still corrected Clara whenever Clara folded towels differently than Mary had. And Ezra still stepped outside at night whenever a horse moved in the dark. But Clara stayed. At first she stayed because the court needed her testimony. Then she stayed because Ruth would not admit she liked the way Clara braided Annie's hair. Then because Matthew asked her to read from the school primer while Ezra rebuilt the barn wall. Then because Annie, half asleep by the stove one evening, reached for Clara's sleeve and did not let go. No one spoke of marriage in those early days. The paper Silas Crow had used to bind her was torn apart in Judge Bell's courtroom and burned in the iron stove. Ezra told Clara she owed him nothing. She could claim her mother's land, sell it, farm it, or leave with Mrs. Bell when the road was safe. Clara listened. Then she looked at the crooked gate, the repaired porch, the 3 children, pretending not to hear from the next room, and the empty cradle, still sitting in the corner. "I was given once," she said quietly. "If I stay, it will be because I choose." Ezra nodded. "Then no one in this house will ask before you do." Spring came slow that year. The north pasture was restored to Clara's name, and the creek land watered Hale cattle under a new agreement written plainly enough for any honest person to understand. Mrs. Bell reopened school with new glass in the windows. Mr. Alden kept his position only after standing before the town and telling the whole truth, not once but again and again, until fear no longer held the story for him. The barn rose board by board. On the day the last beam was set, Annie carried a heel of fresh bread to the doorway and hesitated. Clara watched her from the stove. The child looked down at her apron pocket, then at the table where supper waited for everyone. Slowly, Annie placed the bread on Clara's plate. "For later," she said. Clara knelt careful of the ankle that still ached when rain was coming. "You don't have to save it anymore." Annie's chin trembled. "What if later gets bad again?" Ezra stopped in the doorway. Clara brushed a crumb from the little girl's sleeve. "Then we will open the door, light the stove, and feed whoever comes through it." That is how later changes. Annie thought about that a long time. Then she climbed into Clara's lap, as if she had been doing it all her life. Ruth turned away fast, but not before Clara saw the tears on her face. That night, Ezra moved the empty cradle from the corner. He did not throw it away. He carried it to the loft and covered it clean, not as a wound hidden in shame, but as a memory allowed to rest. When he came back down, Ruth was standing beside Clara with Mary's blue-edged blanket in her hands. She would not want it sitting alone, Ruth said. So Clara folded the blanket across the back of the rocking chair where anyone cold could reach it. Years passed. The crooked gate was mended, but Clara asked Ezra to leave one scar in the wood where the wagon had struck it. Not because she wished to remember the fear, but because she wished never to forget the night mercy had been decided at a door. Ruth grew into a woman who taught frightened children to read without shaming them for being afraid. Matthew became a deputy under a better marshal and never once raised a weapon when a word would do. Annie kept bread on her table every day of her life, and any hungry child in the county knew where to knock. As for Clara and Ezra, love came, the way dawn comes over ranchland, not all at once, but steady enough that one morning everyone realizes the dark has gone. When they finally stood before Judge Bell, by their own choosing, no money changed hands, no guardian signed, and no one spoke of ownership. Ruth held Clara's flowers. Matthew stood beside Ezra with polished boots. Annie cried into Mary's blue-edged blanket and called Clara Ma before the judge could finish. Ezra looked at Clara then, and the grief in his face had not vanished. It had simply made room for living. Many years later, when Clara's hair had silver in it and the Hale porch had more chairs than it once did, storms still came over the ridge. Sometimes thunder shook the windows hard enough to make the grandchildren look up from their supper. Clara would rise open the door and look out at the dark road, not because she was afraid, because somewhere beyond the rain there might be another soul with nothing left but fear. And if this story reminded you that one open door can change a life, write. She opened the door in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe for more frontier stories where kindness still stands against the storm.